Myrtle Allen, who has died aged 94, revolutionised the way we produce, cook and enjoy food in Ireland. This programme, first shown in 2013, is being broadcast again as a tribute to Myrtle Allen, one of the most influential Irish women of the 20th century.
Her contribution to Irish food and our lives is absolutely huge.
That beautiful, simple kind of religious zeal she has of just doing her own thing is very infectious.
More than anybody else, she understood what we have here in terms of the food.
In 1971, Cathal O'Shannon presented Cork's Glorious Food, an RTE documentary about Irish restaurants.
The drama of Irish cuisine is not that it's bad, it's that the Irish believe that it's very good. The statement could have come only from a Frenchman. Two Frenchmen, in fact, Henri Gaud and Christian Milot, authors of the current Guide Julliard de l'Irlande, the classic and best-selling French guidebook to Ireland. These two men characterised the classic Irish restaurant lunch 365 days of the year, and I quote, grapefruit juice, cream of mushroom soup, very grey roast beef, tennis balls, these are mashed potatoes, watery cabbage, watery carrots, a banana. Friday, the authors feel, produces a misery diet suitable only for doing penance.
One of my all-time favourite food writers, Richard Olney, when he came to Ireland in the 1960s, famously described the food as being absolutely abominable.
There was only 2 restaurants in Kenmare in 1980, and today there's 44. So in 1980, if there was only 2, I can only imagine what food in Ireland was like in the 60s.
At the time, most smart restaurant menus would have been written in French, which immediately made them difficult for people to understand. Certain people grasped words, and it created that sort of barrier between the guest and the people who were serving or presenting the food.
French cuisine became global in the 18th and 19th century. Italian food became global in the 20th century. And really what that meant was that was a sort of a status that everybody would try to attain.
It was the gros bonnet de cuisine, the big hat of the kitchen. It was your Hibernian, the Shelburnes, the Greshams. It was all of these big hotels, brigade systems, and a style of food which was easy to replicate and complicated, and not necessarily nature's bounty.
We have all the raw materials, all the good meat, and a climate which should produce the finest vegetables in Western Europe. But on the international culinary map, quite frankly, we stink.
I remember sitting down one winter's day in front of the fire here in Ballymaloe, and there's nobody much around, and thinking, well, now what am I going to do? The children are all starting boarding school, they'll all be away soon, and I'll be here just alone in the house. And it's an enormous house to keep clean, so I suppose I spend all my time just cleaning it. And the idea of having a restaurant was attractive, as it is still, I think, to a lot of people to have your own little restaurant. So I said it to Ivan, and Ivan said, yeah, that's great. But he said, I'm not going to buy you a place. If you're going to have a restaurant, and you've got to do it here, which I did.
Myrtle Hill was born in Cork in March 1924. The Hills were a well-known family of architects, responsible for many of the city's landmark buildings over 3 generations.
We lived in a house in Monkstown overlooking the harbour, which was a lovely position to be in and to be brought up in. I had an older sister, But she was 5 years older than me, so she was always away in a different school and very much ahead of me. My mother was very delicate, actually. She had a very bad heart. She'd been ill. So she was not very active. And my father was an architect, and he worked in Cork every day. The most well-known and outstanding building of my father's was Cash's, as it was known, the big shop. It's Brown Thomas now. And they also did the Munster and Leinster Bank, and he drew the plans for the present School of Commerce.
Henry Hill visited Germany in the 1930s to learn about the modernist movement, and in particular the architecture for educational institutions. On his return, his new designs reflected this source of inspiration.
My father desperately wanted a son to carry on the architectural business. It had already been held by about 3 different generations. So it was a bit of a disappointment when I turned up and was not a boy. My father was very anxious to look out and find the best, newest things, as long as they were good. And he and my mother travelled around England, and they went to all the sort of what would have been called in those days a progressive school. And they found one called Frensham Heights. And it was very sort of modern and open, and at the same time, it was a Church of England school, and it had a certain restraint. That was the summer of 1939. Then suddenly England was at war. I didn't relish the thought of crossing by boat 3 times a year and being in a country that was at war. And I had been fitted with a gas mask in England, and that rather unsettled me a bit. So I went to Newtown instead. And the first thing that happened was I was fitted with a gas mask. So I thought, well, after all that, it's just the same here. Term had started at Newtown when we decided I have to make this change. The headmaster himself met me at the station and drove me to the school, and I was immediately welcomed into the mistress's common room, where they had biscuits and sandwiches, and it would never have happened in England. And as I say, they were so sort of human and welcoming and sweet. And I went into my room with 2 other girls, and they said, "Oh, you're from Cork, you're from Cork. Do you know Ivan Allen? He's rare." Rare was the current word for what it is at the moment, but super. And I said, "No, I don't know him." And that was the end of that, but I didn't realise that they were talking about my husband-to-be.
Ivan Allen was a friend of the family that owned Ballymaloe. Helen Morgan grew up at Ballymaloe and knew Ivan well.
Ivan Allen was the only one of the young ones that had a car. He had a red little thing with a dicky, and he used to take us round in the car. And he was great friends of ours. And actually, my sister Joan, who was 4 years younger than me, had a great friend who was called Myrtle Hill. And Myrtle Hill was invited to Joan's 16th birthday.
I met him here in Ballymaloe in the dining room. I was asked, we were very friendly with the family that stayed here, the Simpsons. And they were giving a dinner party, and then we were all going over to the Ballycotton lifeboat dance in Ballycotton. And his first words to me was, "Do you know my brother met his wife at the Ballycotton lifeboat dance?" I thought that was a bit forward. I remember I had it sort of worked out that there was also somebody else who was very nice and was more in the engineering architectural line, which was quite interesting to me. It's what I came from. But he lived in Waterford. So I made a sort of cold decision that it's much better to have a boyfriend in Cork. And so that was it. That was settled. He just assumed that I'd marry him. I don't think he really asked me properly. He just took it for granted. He said to me one day, we were in my little boat in Cork Harbour, and he said, "When we're married, we'll do such and such a thing." I said, "What?" Those few words in the boat was as far as we got to getting engaged, actually. That would have been about August, September. And I went off then to work in a hostel for old people in Belfast who had been bombed out of their houses. And it was run by Quakers. And having been to a Quaker school, I was into what they were doing. So they needed somebody to work there. And I went up there and came back at Christmas time, and I went to a dance. It was sort of the safe-in dance for Church of Ireland girls, the nice Church of Ireland boys, and he was there. We decided to announce our engagement there and then with young people all around us, many of whom we knew. So I said, look, I better telephone them at home first. I better telephone Daddy before we announce it. And I rang and I said, Daddy, we want to announce our engagement. And the answer was, you will certainly not. Tell Ivan to come and see me in the morning. So I was denied that bit of fun. And so Ivan went along, I think probably in fear and trembling next morning. And anyway, it was passed, and I became engaged to him. I didn't want to go to a hotel for a reception. I wanted to have it at home. And that meant giving my mother a lot of help, really. But she was delighted to have it at home. And you can bet my father was. There's less money to be spent again. Afterwards, we caught the train and went down to Kerry, where we stayed in a wonderful little house. This lady, she was called Molly Line. She had almost wallpaper, not quite, I would say, but she must have had 16 holy pictures all around the walls. And it was very, very simple. Everything was cooked on an open fire and put from the fire onto the kitchen table. And I remember thinking, I'll never get that flavour again, ever, from cooking on the turf, on the open fire, in the old heavy black pots. And so we got absolutely wonderful food there, and interesting food. And it was 6 shillings for a woman and 6 and 6pence for a man to allow him to eat a little bit more than the woman would. And it was very reasonable even in those days.
After their honeymoon, Ivan and Myrtle returned to Ivan's house in Shanagarry.
And we wanted some supper. So Ivan said to me, I'll show you how to scramble an egg, because I hadn't a clue how to scramble an egg. My mother wouldn't let me cook in case I spoiled the food. So he cooked for me the first night, but it didn't go on. I had to discover how to do it myself.
I remember her telling me the reasons why she really wanted to learn how to cook. One of them was that my father-in-law, Ivan, loved his food, and was very appreciative. So that was one reason. And also, she was absolutely convinced of the importance of feeding the children well, so they would be healthy and strong and be able to resist colds and flus and things like that in the winter. So she knew deep down the real importance of your food being your medicine, really, but delicious medicine.
I built up a good library of books by well-known chefs. And I taught myself through reading cookery books and trying it out on the cooker and trying it out again if it wasn't quite right the first time. And eventually you get the flavours and the consistency as good as you possibly can, having tried it out on the family.
My grandmother was the only one of the Litchfield family who married. And she had 3 children, and Daddy was the only one who married. So he automatically came into Ballymaloe when the last of the Litchfields died. It was not a very comfortable place to live. We had no electric light. There was no water in the kitchen. water had been brought in a bucket and boiled on a coal range and put into a tin basin to do the washing up. And the house was very cold, very draughty, very damp. And when my last aunt died in 1944, we had to sell 150 acres to pay her death duties. So when my father came into possession of Ballymaloe, there was no capital left at all. And so he sold about 3 years later. He had to.
Ivan was going into mixed farming. He had been previously entirely in horticulture, tomatoes, apples, cucumbers, that sort of thing. And so he wanted a bit more land.
My father had put the place up for sale with over 400 acres, and we had an awful lot of interest in the place. But the night before the auction, the government slapped a stamp duty of 25% on everything in the country.
Lots of people were at the auction, but there was not one single bid. Everybody went to wish Mr. Simpson well, a good auction and a good sale, but nobody tried to buy it.
My father was in very bad health at the time, and I think they were practically in despair.
Ivan and Mr. Strangman decided carefully what they thought would be a fair price for Mr. Simpson and affordable for them. And they put in a bid to him, and he accepted it. So from then on, we were here. Ivan's mother came from a farm in the north of Ireland, and Ivan longed to farm mixed farming. We also were interested in organic food and growing organically, but we couldn't afford to actually do it. I talked to Ivan about it. He said, well, I can't actually pay for this place and be organic. It won't yield me enough money. So we were not organic. But he farmed as well as he could without actually being organic. He was very careful about his pastures, and everything was as natural as possible. But sometimes we had to give things a shake of the bag to get a bit more money out of it.
Ballymaloe is a 17th century farmhouse run by Mr. and Mrs. Ivan Allen. They have the benefit not just of the produce of their 400-acre farm, but of the salad and fruit that grows wild in the countryside about them.
Because I set up in my own home and started it as a hobby, I was able to do what I wanted to do. I was able to take in a girl or two girls if I needed help. I didn't have to have them if I didn't want the help. Tell you what, let's poach the lot. We'll poach the lot. We'd never get to doing anything else.
Everything had to be done reasonably cheaply.
Yeah.
And I got some fresh wallpaper for the dining room, and I got a carpet for the dining room, because it had been the room where we family had all eaten and sat and played and everything. And then I was faced with getting tables and chairs. And I was looking out through the window and thinking, I'd like to have round tables. And trees are always round, so it must be possible to turn some bit of a tree into a table.
To open up a country house restaurant in a remote location in 1964 must, to Mrs. Allen's family and friends, have seemed like the biggest folly imaginable.
There was a lot of gossip, and there was a feeling that if you had a big house, it wasn't quite the thing to do to commercialise it in that way.
She was quite brave, I think, in challenging the norm or the normative thinking at the time, which was that French was good and Irish was bad. And I think she came from the point that, well, there's nothing wrong with what I'm growing in my fields or what I have grazing in my fields, and why shouldn't I offer that? Why do I have to bring in something from France, or why do I have to get a French chef to do it? I know how best to cook it and present it.
I don't in any way intend to imitate any other country. But if you're cooking with something like tomatoes and onions and peppers and herbs, and you make a dish, you find that, in fact, the French housewife also happens to be cooking with these ingredients, and very often you do a dish without thinking about it, and then you find, in fact, that it's a French dish with a French name. I try just to find the best recipes for the sort of food I've got to hand, and I hope it's a sort of modern Irish kind of cooking. I don't know what you call it, really.
The menu often wasn't written until 7 o'clock, or sometimes 7:15, and then you were, running around, trying to get the fish filleted and do the little sauces and things to go with it. And the menu was written in English, with recognition given that the fish was from Ballycotton, or that the ducks had come from Mrs. Nortridge or Nora Hearn. And that was a completely unique thing. And our menu being written in English, I think it opened a big curtain, and it made for a much more comfortable feeling, and people understood exactly what it was they were ordering. And to see something like a potato and fresh herb soup, well, if that was written in a French menu, it would sound infinitely grander. But essentially it was, along sort of the same lines.
As the children say, it's exactly as they'd had at home anyway, because that's what we were growing and what we had to hand, and what we could pick in the garden, and what my husband was growing in his horticultural area in Shanigary.
It was quite interesting for me in the early days, because this business of the immediacy of where the ingredients came from, that affected everything. And so at 6:30, you'd be sort of wondering, where the hell is the fish? Because you'd literally be waiting for the fish to come from Ballycotton, because Mrs. Allen would not make that decision, even though the first guest would be in the dining room at 7 o'clock. She was not willing to make that decision about the fish until she saw what came in. So it wasn't a question of ringing up the fish supplier and saying, tonight it'll be sea bass or mullet or whatever it'll be. It was a question of seeing what came out of the little day boats in Ballycotton.
Often local kids or teenagers would come to the kitchen door, they'd knock on the door and they'd have those little tin sweet cans full of blackberries or mushrooms or sloes or something. And they says, Miss Allen there? And you'd call Mrs. Allen and she would buy the foraged foods, what we now call foraged foods, from them, and put them on the menu. And of course they'd get some pocket money and everything.
She used to go and collect the watercress in the pond, the secret little river she'd head off in her red Citroen little car, and a couple of hours later would be chomping at the bit at the kitchen back door, waiting to get the watercress to make the soup for that night's dinner as the hours were ticking by.
By any standard, it's an eccentric approach, but actually it's essential, more than eccentric, for the sort of food that made Ballymaloe what it is, really.
It is the ingredients, the provisions that come into the kitchen that rule what way the menu is going to be, what's in really good condition to cook at that moment, nice and fresh.
It's not about overhandling food or fancy food. It's about the raw ingredients and having the knowledge how to cook it simply and to the best you can.
Her ethic was always that the raw material was the most important thing. And then you tried not to let the technique get in the way. Now, this wasn't very fashionable at the time. She was a bit like Alice Waters in California. She concentrated on the quality of the raw ingredients, and this was actually quite revolutionary, because chefy tricks was what it was all about, and Mrs. Allen instead focused completely on the quality of the raw materials. So it was a quiet revolution.
Fish or something like that.
As well as teaching her chefs the importance of the raw ingredients, Myrtle Allen was an early and passionate supporter of small, local artisan producers.
I think it's the short, it's whatever.
When I was planning the restaurant, I knew I'd have to have table cheese available. So I got in touch with Veronica Steele on the Beara Peninsula, and she was about the first person, I think, to start the present wave of Irish farmhouse cheese making.
I started making cheese because I had too much milk. We had one cow, I tried to drink it all, but I just couldn't keep up. The obvious thing to do seemed to me to make cheese. I can't imagine what else you do. I just had enough to make a nice small soft cheese, and thus discovered that it could be done outside France by someone with one cow.
I mean, before that, of course, there were cheeses made in the cooperatives, big rounds of cheddar cheese.
The good cheddars all went to England, and we ate the rubbish which was cooked up and turned into processed cheese. Again, Myrtle turned around and said, let's start eating it ourselves here at home, and this lovely thing began.
The difficulty of finding the sort of produce that she found then, that's really important, really was an effort. Some of it, of course, landed, people would say, I've got this and I'll bring it along. And that was a completely new thing as well, because, it was absolutely, completely new for somebody who was growing something in their garden to find an outlet for it in this sort of way.
That's Mrs. Allen all over. Always, always finding the best produce, absolutely tirelessly. I never once have heard her say, that'll do. She's absolutely just dedicated her life to food.
It was an exciting time in the 60s because whether we knew it or not, we were leading the way. And we had been working on tourism since 1939 with the publication of the 1939 Tourism Acts. We were relatively new around grading as well. In 1949, we brought in grading, much to the, I think, chagrin of the industry. No other country, to my knowledge, had a dedicated tourism development board like Bord Fáilte and a dedicated tourism industry body like CERT. And I have a copy of a 1967 guide here in front of me to Ireland of hotels and guest houses. First of all, the thing that strikes me is the phone numbers. We're talking about technology. There's one in Bantry, and the phone number for the Anchor Hotel in Bantry is 12. So it's Bantry 12. But the Metropole, as an A-star hotel, which would have been the biggest hotel in Cork at the time, it was 119 rooms, of which 46 had baths. And at the beginning of the guide, it lays out some of the rules and regulations and about how things work. But I think it was expected, for instance, that you'd have a full license. So, especially for hotels, but not for guest houses.
I don't know whether you ever heard of a Shebeen, which was a place where you saw liquor without a license. So there are the things you could do in those days,
We were not able to serve beers and spirits legally. Wine, of course, we could serve. Port, there's no problem there. As my husband used to say, we're not allowed to sell any Irish drinks, only foreign ones.
You could do nothing nowadays without the law coming on you for something, So but that's the way it was in those days.
In order to be able to sell beers and spirits, a restaurant required a licence, which was expensive to buy. The alternative was to apply for a hotel licence.
To have a hotel licence, I had to have hotel rooms, which I hadn't up to that point. So we had to convert 10 bedrooms to comply with the law and register as a hotel, and thus be able to give old Mr. So-and-so his brandy after dinner, legally. I remember Ivan said to Joe, I'd like you to come and help me serve the wines. And Joe said, oh, well, I've never done anything like that, sir. And Ivan said, well, neither have I, Joe. We'll learn together. And it was a bit like that. We're all learning together.
I knew nothing whatsoever about wines. I thought it was the most ridiculous thing going, is in dinner wine, That's compared to any other drink like whiskey or something, But anyway, we plugged along and we learned the way and we got used to it, and we knew all the good wines after a while,
The wine list in Ballymaloe was always kind of slightly out of date. The pricing was out of date. The wines were getting better and they were getting proportionately cheaper. So I remember having a couple of discussions with Ivan about this, but they weren't necessarily my own interest. I was telling him that they weren't priced properly. And that was adjusted, I think, too, in time.
I didn't want too many people to start with, quite rightly. We were far too green. But they took off when the Egon Roney people, the inspector, travelled round. And we got a letter in the Irish Times saying that it was very good and could become famous. And that little article had such an effect on our numbers. I think straight away, I remember thinking it, the number of people for dinner went up multiplied by 2 or 3 times.
At one stage, quite early on, Myrtle had and Ballymaloe had the top rating in the food guides in the British Isles. And so the chefs, you know, and so on were saying, who the hell is this woman, you know, who's opened a restaurant down in a farm, in the middle of a farm, in a country house down in the country, and she writes the menu every day, and, you know, it all seemed so amateurish to them. You know, they were astonished that somebody who'd broken all the rules, that this was the place that seemed to be being acknowledged by the guides.
Ballymaloe House and the Yates Room restaurant is one of 3 which this year won the accolade of a laurel cluster in the Good Food Guide. In all of England, only a dozen are equally honoured. In Scotland, 1. In Wales, none at all.
They were instrumental in the formation of the Blue Book, which is an association with over 40 members today of some of the finest properties in Ireland. When they started back in, I think it was the early 70s, they put that association together. There was only 5 members in it, and Myrtle and the Allens were hugely influential in pulling it together. Many other countries sell destinations. Ireland sell a touring holiday predominantly, and that is very much down to the fact that back in the 60s and back in the 70s, they worked together to promote coming into Dublin, going over to Galway and coming down the west coast. And that is part of the whole bedrock of tourism in Ireland.
We always loved having people. We had lots of friends that came to see us long before we ever had a restaurant. And I think we greet them as friends and they feel comfortable and welcome. And that's the best you can do, really, if you're running a hotel.
First of all, she's an innkeeper. She's a keeper of an old country house. And hospitality comes with that. And her approach is to feeding her friends, is to feeding her guests. And I think that has worked really, really well and found an awful lot of followers worldwide.
I think they feel that we're informal. When we first took the first few guests, my husband and I said, well, we've got to have them. And if they ask us to stand on our heads, we'll stand on our head for them. We'll do whatever to please them and get them coming back.
In the later days, Ivan would sit in the hall, lapping up the sort of compliments, I suppose, and he used to say, occasionally being mistaken for the porter by first-time guests, and of course he would immediately take the cases and do what they expected.
Tonight we have gooseberry and elderflower fool with some Jane biscuits. We have honeycomb ice cream, chocolate roulade, strawberry and rhubarb compote, and some fresh cream.
I've been there and been eating and got talking to people at adjacent tables who actually kind of say, is this it? And you say yes, and you realise that they sort of thought, but it isn't the Georges V, it isn't Treetops, it isn't whatever. And they couldn't see what Ballymaloe was because they you know, it has this global reputation, and yet at a core, it's still a domestic scale operation.
The simplicity is the authenticity, and that's what we probably liked. I mean, that's what I certainly like. You felt you were in a home.
The family are so ingrained in everything that happens there that when you go to Ballymaloe, you meet the family every time you go, whether it's a granddaughter, a daughter, whether it's Darina, whether it's Myrtle. And it is this oasis of quality food production. The last time I spent some time there, I brought my kids with me, and we just wandered through their farm as well as spoke to Darina about what she's doing there, speaking about the slow food movement actually at the time. And we set aside about 40 minutes for that whole trip. And 2.5 hours later, we were still there wandering through the greenhouses, talking about how they can produce organic food, in the way that they do.
So many regular guests come to stay at the house. She would say, oh no, that particular family are here, and I really know that Mr. So-and-so really loves the roast rack of lamb, or the pork, whatever it was. And she'd make sure to put that on the menu for that particular night because she'd know that that guest was coming. And that was amazing, absolutely amazing.
One morning, I got a letter from Brussels from a chef who said they were starting a European movement of chefs to protect the food. They felt that the food in Europe was being really industrialized a bit. And would I be interested in possibly joining? So I was absolutely thrilled to get that letter, because that's the way I was feeling about Irish food all the time.
The flavour of food, the quality of the food. We were just trying to make sure that the authorities in Europe didn't make the food too bland, that they didn't affect the raw materials. And it went from one end of Europe to the other, and we all had a different set of problems, but at the end they were the same problems. Dealing with bureaucracy, guys who knew nothing about food were trying to tell us how to run our kitchens, and that's what it was set up to do. And Mrs. Allen was the perfect one to fight that corner.
I remember I have an article. It was in a chef magazine by Paul Bocuse. Paul Bocuse is the greatest and probably the best known chef in the world. And he had so much admiration for Myrtle Allen, for what she'd done, for maybe making Ireland as a food destination, for really standing for what she believed in, And, she was very proactive. I'm sure it took up a huge amount of her time, as well as running Ballymaloe, but to be the Commissioner of Europe for the Eurotalks. So she was able to go directly to Parliament with different food issues from abattoirs in Ireland and different things that have happened over the years. So she was always on the side of the small artisan producer. She was their voice and she waved their flag.
Top chefs in France, which is the home of grand cooking, they value her. Revere her.
It's a very brave person to stand up there in front of European chefdom and tell them what to do, and not a problem to her. She has an iron will inside that quietly spoken frame. She is a force to be reckoned with, for definite.
In 1984, after many years of writing for the Irish Farmers' Journal and the Irish Times, Myrtle Allen wrote the Ballymaloe cookbook.
One of the reasons I wrote the book was I thought if there's a book published, at least I won't lose the recipes. There'll be somewhere around, even if somebody else does them as well. The thing is not to bother about other people using your recipes if you're a cook. I can't think of anything that's so unique and precious that you shouldn't write about it.
The significant thing about the Ballymaloe cookbook is that it has been in print for decades. So it remains within terms of Irish cookery writing, it's talismanic. You have to have it, you have to know it.
There was so much of Myrtle Allen's own personality in the book. This was a book which evoked the whole spirit of Ballymaloe. The blend of personal stories of her life experience, her experience as running a guest house, her experience as a cook, all of this was distilled into stories which were told and which then were linked to the recipes.
Many books are just a collection of recipes. In Mrs. Allen's case, she describes how she came to discover all kinds of little tricks, as she sometimes calls them, and the anecdotes that she puts with the food and the sort of extra detail she gives you, that you really are. It's as close as you could be, I think, to being down in the kitchen and learning there with her.
This is something that was completely new in cookbooks in the 1980s. And whereas it might be fashionable now, it certainly wasn't then. We have had frequent conversations, Myrtle and I, about revising it. But, when something works, why fix it? The number of homes you go into and you see the Ballymaloe cookbook is there, well-thumbed versions of it. That's a testimony to any cookbook.
She ends up by saying, if I could start a fashion, it would be to recapture some forgotten flavours or to preserve some that may soon die. And then she ends with this stunning quote. "The butter your sister is sending us is very good," I said to my neighbour one day. "Yes," he said, "that field always made good butter." That is long ago, and the fragrance is almost forgotten. Well, what struck me when I read that, again, was that field has always produced good butter. Is in France, they say that field has always produced exceptional grapes or vines, and they have their appellation and all of that. And that I think in that sense, Myrtle is she just naturally embodies what we admire France for.
When Myrtle Allen started Ballymaloe in 1964, chefs and restaurateurs were almost exclusively male. A young woman called Dorina O'Connell, keen to learn how to cook, found herself at Ballymaloe in 1968.
I couldn't get into Jamais or the Russell in Dublin because at that time men were chefs and women couldn't get into the top kitchens, you know. So, and I told her I wanted to learn more about fresh herbs. I wanted to learn how to make homemade ice cream and soufflés and pâtés. All those things sounded incredibly exotic.
My first dining experience in Ballymaloe was probably 91. I was brought there by some executives, Irish distillers. And I think one of the executives mentioned something about Richard coming to spend some time in your kitchen or something. And one thing led to another. And Myrtle had the great quip of only Ballymaloe trained chefs can cook Ballymaloe food. And frankly, I took great offence to it. And I'll be honest with you, myself and Myrtle had nearly a stand-up row in a restaurant. I think she found sense later on because we ended up having a glass of wine in one of the front rooms and having a good laugh and talking over plans of what I was doing in London and one thing and the other. But I have to say it was a chilly moment between the two of us. But, you know, she didn't know me. I didn't know much about her. But I thought, you know what I mean, the simple leg of lamb she served that night, I could easily match, if not better. So that was my approach. You know, I was a bit of a young bull. I was in my 20s. And certainly, you know what I mean, some granny telling me that, you know what I mean, I didn't get her message at that time because I didn't know her. But her message I understand a lot now, all these years later.
You either got Ballymaloe or you didn't. And if you got it, you got Mrs. Allen and you got what she was all about. And then it made sense to stay and to be there and to work your way around the kitchen because it's not like kitchens are now. I mean, the lamb came in you know, it was a lamb, and the beef came in you know, whole sirloins and ribs. It was a proper apprenticeship, and you were learning real skills, and you were really learning how to be a cook rather than maybe how to expedite food.
The atmosphere was great. Again, it was that learning attitude. There was no blaring music, anything. It was just a steady atmosphere full of knowledge.
I listened to every word she said. I was like a sponge and I soaked up everything she told me and did exactly what she said because I knew that she was different, that she had a different kind of palate. And it was all, she's such a modest woman and there was never any fuss about anything, but she always got right to the kernel of things.
In the last, now, 22 years that I've known her, Mrs. Allen has always, when she always did, she would always test food before it went out, before it was being served, tasting all the soups, tasting everything, apart from two dishes, and they were Mr. Allen's, the Ballycotton fish soup and Ivan Allen's dressed crab. And he would come down to the kitchen from his little table. He had a table in the kitchen up by the order board in the kitchen. He sadly died in 98. But before then, he would come down to the kitchen and taste. If you were on Ballycotton fish soup that night, if that was your thing, you always kind of think, oh, I need to call Mr. Allen now and ask him to come down and taste it. And he would taste it. And Mrs. Allen, Myrtle, would say, well, what do you think, Ivan? I think so too. I think it needs a bit more seasoning. I think it needs that. And but even now, in her late 80s, she's still the same.
I mean, I remember as a young chef, I was earning whatever, very little money at the time, but I would go down about once a month and I would spend my week's wages having dinner in Ballymaloe. And there was always something that she was doing that would absolutely blow me away. And I'd come back saying, the next time I can afford to, I'll be down having dinner there as well.
We all have the same goals, that we want to produce beautiful food, you know, use local and fresh Irish ingredients. And, you know, she was the forefront of it for all of us in cooking. We looked up to her and she still is to this day. What she's achieved in Ballymaloe is absolutely sensational.
She trains people who come away from here with a real motivation to want to cook for the real reasons. I've been in many catering schools where people come out and they want to be on television and make a lot of money. But here, they really, really want to do good food. And they really are enthusiastic. So, in a way, she passes on her enthusiasm. You know, it's contagious.
When I was working in the kitchen at Ballymaloe, I noticed that the kitchen was very quiet, always very quiet. No radio on. That wasn't allowed because she said you need to use all your senses when you're cooking. You need to be able to listen to what the food is doing. She said you can hear when something's bubbling over, when something's burning. And of course, that's true. And also, everyone was quiet. There was an etiquette in the kitchen. You know, everyone spoke nicely to each other. No bad language, no shouting. So there were no big egos in there. And especially not hers. And should I just empty them out?
Oh, yeah.
I think celebrity is one of those words that somehow doesn't fit comfortably with Myrtle. She would never see herself as being a celebrity. But for all that, she has been an enormous influence on the whole world of cooking and of hospitality in Ireland. But celebrity, no.
They created tourism and not just a food product. They certainly highlighted the food product in Ireland and the wonderful produce that is available to us here. But more importantly, in my mind, it was the bedrock and the foundation on which a quality tourism product was based. And I think that is absolutely down to Myrtle.
Mrs. Allen has always felt the same about food. She's never gone with different trends, you know, things that come and go in a couple of years. She's always been so confident in what she believes is right. Old methods of farming as opposed to new ones. Whatever is right and best for food and best for our bodies, that's what she has stuck with.
It's beautiful to see how the chefs around the country, and not just in Ireland, love her and honour her. She's like the grand-mère of all of them.
There's lots of ego involved in the chef world, and Mrs. Allen is the great example of someone who brings all this integrity to play without ego, and it's rare, believe me.
She caused multiple generations of cooks, I would say at this stage, to understand that this can be as good as anywhere.
The trickle down of her initial work, her journalism, her teaching, her standards, her emphasis on the authenticity, the provenance of the food, the artisan producers. She's really a champion of the local producer and of the authentic. And I think there are many, many people indebted to her who don't even know her name.
She thinks, I think, that she's just doing it all on quite a small scale. But it's absolutely bigger than anyone realises, even her.
That's really the big message of Myrtle, is respect the soil and let nature's bounty, you know what I mean, arrive to your table.
Since 1964, she has articulated this very passionate, generous, sustainable ethic of working, cooking, farming, and being.
I think learn as much as you can, really. So, I went to the School of Commerce as soon as I left school and did cooking and dressmaking there. And the art school where I wasn't ever going to shine. And I think it's that go and get experience. I remember thinking I'd like to have a whole series of experiences behind me. Traveling, going to places, knowing about things. And I would say go and learn everything you can because it'll always come in useful afterwards. And watch other people and just listen to them. They might be right, they might be wrong, but just listen to what they're saying.
If you work very hard and if things go wrong, it's very heartbreaking and there's no satisfaction. If you work very hard and it's success, there is satisfaction. But apart from that, I do get enormous satisfaction in being able to give people the food that I think we ought to be eating.